On this Thursday night, explosions rock Ukraine's capital. New missile strikes on central Kyiv as the UN Secretary-General is in the city for talks with Ukraine's president. The U.S. pledges tens of billions of dollars more to Ukraine, and families go on heartbreaking searches for loved ones. Ban banished.
It's about time.
Canada's landmark decision, who is no longer forbidden from donating blood. Turning off the taps, the feud between some Alberta farmers and a First Nation, and what resolved it. Plus, astronomical goal.
We need that footprint.
The hopes and hurdles in creating Canada's first commercial space facility.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
The terrifying sounds of war have once again reached Ukraine's capital. President Volodymyr Zelensky says 5 rockets targeted Kyiv tonight. The city's mayor says 2 of them hit, sending plumes of black smoke billowing over a residential district. Emergency responders say 1 person has been killed and several others injured. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Those missiles hit soon after the Secretary-General of the UN met President Zelensky in Kyiv. António Guterres is safe, but Ukraine's defense minister calls the missile strikes an attack on the security of the Secretary-General and on the world. Just 2 days ago, Guterres was at the Kremlin trying to negotiate with Russia's president to end the violence. Today, the UN chief toured towns near Kyiv, where Russian troops are accused of committing war crimes. And he voiced his support for a thorough investigation and accountability by the International Criminal Court. A warning, our coverage tonight includes some disturbing images. We begin in Kyiv, where those missiles hit not long ago. Crystal Goomansingh is there. Crystal?
Donna, we could hear those explosions off in the distance, and no sooner were we cleared from our shelter that a second set of explosions could be heard. Loud bangs very close to us. In fact, we could not only smell fire, but we could see one burning as well. The fact that this happened during the UN Secretary-General's visit leaves little to doubt. And like the UN Secretary-General who visited Bucha, we were also there. That city has really endured a lot of the horrors of this war. It is a small white tent, but the structure gives shelter to those seeking answers. Every day, dozens of survivors come here searching for their dead loved ones. This woman found her 15-year-old grandson's body. Her cries set against the steady hum of the refrigerator truck holding his remains, and so many others. Agonizing searches have been ongoing since the moment Russian forces were driven out of Bucha. The city's 50,000 residents were bombed and terrorized for days. Bucha was considered the most dangerous place near Kyiv.
My work day is like this. They are calling, and it's like hundreds of people I have to talk every day.
Work at the morgue is never ending. Tanks have been removed, streets cleared, but for the residents of Bucha who survived, they are now in another phase of this war: grief.
We opened here information center as the Bucha City Council, and we are helping relatives to find their killed or died moms, fathers, daughters, sons, and so on.
Workers and volunteers can appear expressionless, perhaps numb to the relentless horrors of the war that they've endured. Perhaps they're simply too busy to pause and reflect. The silence of this busy site is broken only by the occasional mourner or the calls from crows nesting in the trees above. The hundreds of bodies brought here are from where they died on the streets or exhumed from mass graves. Women and children are among them.
If we look at the figure 412, that means every third in Kyiv region. So every third in Kyiv region was killed here in Bucha.
Well, the images of bodies piled up is graphic and unsettling. The work happening here is actually critical. The bodies will hold evidence, potentially answering key questions about what happened here that can be used by international investigators to build a war crimes case against Russia. 2 teams spend every morning here performing post-mortems and then meticulously documenting their findings in the afternoon.
I wake up every morning at 3 o'clock, and Victor and Yuri are already in front of my eyes.
Nadia, Valentina, and Serhiy found their 2 relatives after a month-long search. They tell us it appears Nadia's ex-husband and his brother were tortured. Their loss is devastating, especially for Serhiy.
Sergei cried and shouted so loudly, begging them to live alive, at least one of them, for him.
It is impossible to escape the horrors of this war, and some of those bearing witness to it are so young, they'll carry the memories for a lifetime. There are still so many unidentified bodies. French forensic teams working on the ground in Bucha are starting to use DNA technology. They're taking swabs from the remains so that it'll be easier to connect remains with relatives when they come searching, but that technology won't be in place to help out until next week. Donna?
All right, Crystal Goomansingh in Kyiv, Ukraine tonight. Thanks. Russia claims the U.S. and Poland are plotting to invade western Ukraine and occupy it. In a statement, the chief of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service cited unpublished intelligence claiming Washington and Warsaw are working to establish tight military and political control over what he calls Poland's historical possessions in Ukraine. Polish officials say it is not true, that it's more Russian disinformation intended to drive a wedge between Poland and Ukraine. Today, the American president reiterated his message that Russia is the aggressor, and Joe Biden said as long as atrocities continue, the U.S. will continue to supply weapons to Ukraine.
Despite the disturbing rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, the facts are plain for everybody to see. We're not attacking Russia. We're helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression.
Biden has asked Congress for another $33 billion in aid and weapons to Ukraine, a signal the U.S. is preparing to help Kyiv for the long haul. And Canada's defense minister says our troops are training their Ukrainian counterparts on how to use the howitzers Canada has sent. Anita Anand was in Washington today for meetings at the Pentagon. Abigail Bimman has those developments.
Anita Anand arrives at the Pentagon for her first official visit as Canada's defense minister.
You know, we don't have a better friend than Canada.
The U.S. Defense Secretary commended Canada for this week's announcement. Our country is sending 8 armored vehicles to Ukraine. And on the M777 howitzers Canada sent last week,
I can confirm that Canadian soldiers are now training their Ukrainian counterparts in the use of these weapons.
Well, it's no surprise that we had such a highly productive meeting today.
The pair met for just under an hour. No specific commitments came of it, but the conversation extended beyond Ukraine to include NORAD, the Arctic, and climate resilience.
It's a very complex chess game going on. Horse trading going on. And,
behind closed doors, one analyst believes talks would have included what the U.S. may do to backfill Canada's weapons supply.
What we can promise the Ukrainians in part depends on the American willingness to help us restock. So I think the conversation is very much about, well, we'll do this if you do that.
Earlier this week, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made headlines saying the goal is to weaken Russia.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
Asked about that today, Canada's Prime Minister stayed far away from such strong language.
We are united in wanting to see Russia not just pay for this terrible decision, but be held accountable for it.
In terms of Canadians training Ukrainians on the howitzers, Anita Anand did not offer any specifics. A Canadian government source would only say that training is not happening on Ukrainian soil. Donna?
Abigail Bimman at the Pentagon. Thanks. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says Ottawa is moving forward with new legislation that would enable Canada to not only freeze the assets of Russians who have been sanctioned, but seize the assets and liquidate them, giving the money to Ukrainian war victims and to help rebuild Ukraine. It's working with G7 allies to craft legislation, and today Washington signaled it plans to follow suit. Joly was at the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee in Ottawa today. She says Canada and its allies must be ready for all scenarios, including Russia deploying nuclear weapons.
clearly their invasion is a failure and will continue to be a failure. And we won't stop our efforts until Ukraine wins.
Jolie also says Canada intends to reopen its embassy in Kyiv soon. The federal government is giving nearly $6 million more to Canada's special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and fighting anti-Semitism.
Preserving the truth of the survivors also includes ensuring that we have the places that will hold these stories over the years to come.
The announcement was made during a ceremony for Holocaust Remembrance Day. The federal government will roll out the new funding over the next 5 years. Now, to the federal government's policies on the environment. Canada's environmental watchdog says the government is being impractical about reducing emissions and that it's likely impossible for the government to reach its emission targets over the next 8 years. Eric Sorensen on the report and the reaction.
The city of Winnipeg is testing clean hydrogen fuels, turning big city buses into zero-emissions vehicles. Ottawa believes hydrogen will help meet its 2030 carbon emissions targets. But Canada's Environment Commissioner says in his report the government is not being realistic. For example, Natural Resources Canada estimates clean hydrogen could reduce carbon emissions up to 45 megatons by 2030, while Environment and Climate Change Canada estimates reductions of just 15 megatons. While the Environment Commissioner himself says both are making unrealistic assumptions for modeling the potential of hydrogen.
The assumptions in the federal hydrogen strategy are overly optimistic and compromise the credibility of the expected emission reductions.
When it comes to paying taxes for carbon emissions, the Commissioner's report found big industrial polluters disproportionately pay less than smaller businesses and Indigenous groups, while Ottawa's program allows provinces to have different pricing schemes.
It's a weak program, and it gives the sense to some that industry isn't paying its fair share compared to everyday Canadians.
Reaching targets will only take longer, say experts, if some industries get unfair exemptions.
Not addressing the larger polluters today is going to delay the faster transition later.
For workers in fossil fuel industries, the Commission says Ottawa still hasn't introduced promised legislation to help them transition to new jobs.
They talk about a just transition from oil and gas, but provide no support to Canadian energy workers who are losing their jobs.
The Minister of Environment pointed to successes while acknowledging the government must do more.
The Commissioner said that the federal government would reach its 25% emission reduction target this year, not in 2025. Our plan is working. I'll agree that there's way more we need to do.
Indeed, the Environment Commissioner says Canada lags behind other G7 countries in reducing greenhouse gases.
We cannot afford a fourth decade of failure on climate action.
And the climate change clock, he says, never stops ticking. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
A major modification to blood donation rules coming up, the new criteria for giving the gift of life. There is a big policy change about blood donations in Canada. Gay men will no longer be automatically banned from donating, something that's long been considered discriminatory and homophobic. The new policy will screen all donors about their sexual behavior, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. As Jamie Maracher reports, advocates say it's about time.
Patients across Canada need donors more than ever.
And by the end of September, more Canadians will be eligible to offer an arm, including 34-year-old Anthony Falls, who is blood type O, a universal donor.
It's about time. It still shocks me in 2022 that as a gay male, I actually can't donate blood.
In Canada since 1992, any man who had sex with another man was barred from giving the gift of life over concerns the gay community was at higher risk to transmit HIV. Over the last decade, Health Canada okayed Canadian Blood Services to relax the donor deferral policy. In 2019, it was reduced to 3 months.
The 3-month rule didn't make sense because the chances of them bringing HIV into the blood system was so incredibly low.
Now, all donors will be equally screened for sexual behavior regardless of their gender or sexual orientation.
That to us is an inclusive process, a fair process, and one that is rooted in science and evidence.
Advocates have been demanding federal intervention for years. Criticized for moving too slowly, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made recurrent pledges to lift the ban.
We're ending the blanket ban on MSM donations, but it took too long. This should have been done 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Years of lost contributions, registered nurse Tyler Watt has been wanting to make up for.
We are constantly facing shortages of blood. I've actually witnessed it in my own practice.
Glad his sexuality will no longer determine whether he can be part of the solution. Jamie Morocker, Global News, Toronto.
Ahead, water rights, why an Alberta First Nation turned off the taps to farmers. There is a new development tonight in the federal government's long-standing promise to end boil water advisories on First Nations. The Minister of Indigenous Services says the claims period is now open for compensation applications. The money comes from a class action lawsuit settlement initiated in 2019. Nearly $8 billion is being made available for those deprived of clean drinking water and for things like the modernization of Canada's First Nations drinking water legislation.
It's unfortunate that we have lost so many over the years, including my late son, who never got a chance to drink from the tap.
Prime Minister Trudeau promised to end all long-term drinking water advisories by 2021. 132 advisories have been lifted, 33 remain in effect. Water is flowing once again to farmers in southern Alberta after a 2-week-long protest caused fields to go dry. It's a dispute over water rights. The Lethbridge Irrigation District draws water from a river but relies on a diversion weir on a nearby First Nation. And at the start of this month, Indigenous leaders turned off the tap. Heather Urix-West explains why.
All the irrigation is run by separate water.
For cattle farmer Troy Bischler, water is life.
The producers in this area, we're talking 250,000 head of cattle that need water every day.
So when the canals around here began to go dry, farmers like Bischler grew anxious.
But it's not just livestock being impacted. All these fields rely on irrigation, and without water, the hay and cereal crops will suffer.
This part of southern Alberta doesn't see a lot of rain. Agriculture depends on water diverted from the Old Man River, a river that runs through the Piikani Nation Reserve. Every spring, the canal gates open from a weir on Piikani land. But on April 12th, the nation closed it tight.
At times where we get very protective of our river, it's sacred to us.
Councillor Rial Houle says the act of protest wasn't taken lightly. He says 20 years after a water rights agreement was first signed between the nation and the federal and provincial governments, a lot has changed. For one, the province wants to build a new, upgraded weir.
The province wants to come in and build a new one. And Piikani Nation wants to be a part of that because, it's a major project that's happening on our lands.
Houle says after 5 years of writing to the province with environmental and economic concerns, turning off the taps was finally an act of desperation. But it worked.
We're finally moving in a good direction. But, to be honest, Heather, it took the 9th hour for them to come and talk to the Piikani Nation.
2 weeks later, the province and the Piikani reached an agreement to start working together, and the gate was opened up again.
The Piikani need to have a seat at the table and be part of the conversation to make sure that any work that we do on the weir, any of the infrastructure system, is protecting the environment long term.
So this is a really good example of the long term and even contemporary effects of failing to resolve these historical disputes. And like I say, there are literally hundreds of these across the country.
But for the hundreds of disputes between First Nations groups and governments across Canada, infrastructure disrupting protests like the ones that blocked rail lines in early 2020 are exceedingly rare. In most cases, Indigenous groups take these battles to court, where they often win.
Then the question comes, why are we not resolving them more quickly?
In the end, no lengthy court battle was necessary for the Piikani Nation. Just an act of desperation and a couple of dry, anxious weeks. Heather Urix-West, Global News, Calgary.
Next, high hopes to connect a small town in Nova Scotia with space. There are hopes for Atlantic Canada to make some space history. A Canadian company has been working hard to get this country's first commercial spaceport built in Nova Scotia. It's all still coming together, and there have been a few setbacks, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ross Lord on the plans and the obstacles.
With more rockets than ever blasting off into space for expanding satellite technology or for wealthy celebrities to get their kicks, why not make Canada a rocket launching center?
Canada doesn't have a footprint directly right now into the into space for launching the satellites, and we're putting hundreds of satellites into space. So we need that footprint.
That footprint, a spaceport, could be near Canso, Nova Scotia, an historic fishing community that's struggled since the cod collapse of the 90s. The developer, Maritime Launch Services, says it's acquired the land needed for the launch pad and control center and is working on final environmental approvals.
We've done, a significant portion of the compliance pieces that came with the EA approval. Wetland mitigation plan, wildlife management plan.
The company says it chose the Canso area because its remote location makes it a safe place for launching satellite technology into space. Its current plan is a test launch of sorts next year, blasting a rocket past the 100-kilometer threshold that's considered the beginning of space. Money-making flights would follow. But the spaceport is already running behind schedule, and there's a new concern: the war in Ukraine, where Maritime Launch's supplier of medium-range rockets is based. The company says the war has not disrupted operations yet. Working in its favor, the federal government has expressed support, and Maritime Launch is now asking for government funding after saying it would not pursue tax dollars, hoping the right boosters will seal the deal. Ross Lord, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is this view of Banff, Alberta from the top of Sulphur Mountain, a stunning spot. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to us, and thanks for watching. Chris Galis will be at the anchor desk tomorrow, and I will see you on Saturday for the new reality. Bye-bye.